Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on the top trends in supply chain sustainability for 2025. My name is Andy Gibbard, and I'll be your moderator for today. This session complements our recent Supply Chain Risk Outlook webinar, where we highlighted the key risks threatening supply chain sustainability based on insights from our EIQ platform. If you were not able to attend this webinar, or if you're interested in hearing more about EIQ, please visit our website at eiq.com to download the full report and to watch the webinar. Before we get started, I'd just like to go over a few points so that you know how to participate in today's event. You've joined today using your computer's speaker system by default. If you prefer to join over the telephone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. You'll also have the opportunity to ask questions by typing them into the questions pane of the control panel. You can send in your questions at any time during the presentation, and we will follow up afterwards on any questions that we don't get the chance to answer today. Finally, this webinar is being recorded, and you'll receive a follow-up email within 48 hours with a link to view the recording. I'd now like to introduce Kevin Franklin, Chief Product Officer at LRQA, and our expert in supply chain sustainability. Kevin, over to you.
Thank you, Andy, for that very kind, if not slightly intimidating introduction. And thank you all for joining. Very much look forward to this conversation together. Before we get into discussing the trends, at least 8 of the trends, perhaps a few minutes to just briefly remind you on LRQA. Many of you will already know us as an organization, but in summary, we're certainly one of the world's leading global risk management and assurance partners. LRQA is a company with well over 200 years of history. We now work with over 60,000 clients globally, have over 5,000 colleagues dotted around the world in 150 plus countries. But primarily as a business, we're focusing on servicing our clients in the areas of assuring assets and management systems, achieving food/product integrity, responsible sourcing, navigating the energy transition, and of course, focusing on strengthening cyber security maturity. We look at these as end-to-end solutions that we offer to you as key clients, supporting you to really navigate what is a very fast-changing and high-risk operating environment. Now, how do we do that? Perhaps I can talk you through the concept that we label Assurance 4.0 and that we introduced roughly this time last year. As I mentioned, LRQA is a company with well over 200 years of history, but the idea of assurance really came into being in the 1980s and matured through the 90s and 2000s as it moved from this point in time when we saw ISO 9001 as the first formal certification and assurance standard to one where the ISO 9000 framework was expanded to cover 14,000, ultimately also into multiple other standards like 27,000, 50,000, 40,000. We now live in a world where there are multiple different standards for assurance covering different themes and really all leveraging that management systems infrastructure. But what has happened in parallel is the world itself has fundamentally changed around us. So we've moved to a world that's much faster paced. It's a world with much more information. It's a world that is digital and is a world that is increasingly connected and interconnected in ways that we've really never experienced before. As we look at really 2024 and navigate into 2025 and beyond, we recognized this time last year that we were at a point where we need to lean in to support companies through this process of navigating those risks and of the transformation that comes with that as their business models shift and change to be much more responsive to the kind of hyper-dynamic environment in which we operate. And of course, geopolitically, with some of the changes we've seen, particularly Trump and changes to the US administration and other geographic changes, this is more of an imperative than ever before. Now, in order to deliver on this imperative, we really need to be leveraging and using data and data-driven insights. That is more important today than ever before, just like so many of the other items we mentioned on the previous slide. And as a result, a lot of the intelligence that we'll share both during this session, but that you will find in really most of the thought leadership we put out, comes from eiq.com, our supply chain intelligence software and platform, where we leverage a lot of the derivative and also aggregate data from the real world work we do on the ground every day, where we visit not just 150 countries, but 30,000 plus suppliers every year for audits, for corrective action plan management, for worker surveys, for grievance mechanisms, and a range of other supply chain ESG related activities. Again, all designed to support the management of that risk landscape. Now, with that as background context, let's look at 2025. It may not feel like it, but we as supply chain and sustainability professionals are really more privileged than ever before to be working in the field that we are. And why is that? Well, because ESG, sustainability, and supply chains are truly at the center of the global political, economic, and societal discourse today. A lot of the topics that we will discuss here are really kind of macro issues that impact the entire world and really manifest focus oftentimes most concretely in the supply chain arena. So for those of you that are running supply chain programs or are a supplier, a brand retailer, or working in the kind of near adjacent spaces, the pressures you feel today are not just sustainability ideas, goals, and objectives that they may have been 15, 20 years ago, but they're right at the center of the global narrative, of the global discourse. And this is both challenging, but it's also a huge privilege and a huge opportunity. During the course of this session, we're going to navigate quite nimbly through really 8 key topics or trends. We'll first talk about the growing gap between ambition and preparedness, navigating into the regulatory agenda and what's happening in that space. Obviously, we've got to talk about geopolitics. We couldn't talk about sustainability and ESG without doing that. We'll talk a bit about data. We'll talk about supplier relations and how those have evolved and how they need to continue evolving. And we'll talk about risks and the risk landscape and how that's changed geographically and also a bit from a product or production perspective. And then we'll talk about some of the interesting synergies we're seeing between some what were previously quite different topics like food safety, product integrity, and the supply chain ESG space. And lastly, we will close out with some thoughts around the role of the investor community, which is of course one that has been quite pivotal in shaping the ESG agenda, certainly over the last 5 or 6 years. So let's navigate our way into this first topic, one around the growing gap between ambition and preparedness. This is a very interesting topic, and I think in 2024, a lot of us who are people who've worked in sustainability for 10, 15, 20 years saw this flowing into the media, dribs and drabs and bit by bit, and with it came a lot of questions around our careers in the sustainability space, the roles and responsibilities of some companies that were previously real leaders in sustainability, where they may have been seen as potentially backtracking on some of their previous ambitions, and where actually they may have been caught unprepared from some of the differences in opinions or narrative or media viewpoints that came along and around some of those conversations. Now, there's also been a lot of work that's been done by organizations like the World Benchmarking Alliance, Harvard Business Review, and many others, where actually through ongoing reviews of business, their performance against topics like climate change, human rights, by sector, etc., there have been some interesting insights. Certainly what we have seen is that actually from the World Benchmarking Alliance in particular, around 90% of the 2,000 companies that they assess on an annual basis are perhaps not as far towards addressing human rights, decent work, and ethical conduct issues as one might have expected, certainly after having been doing this for a number of years. In addition, we've seen a lot of companies that had previously done this well, scaling back their sustainability targets, and a number of large retailers and other businesses not necessarily having clear strategies or programs of work in place to deliver on some of the commitments that they may have made in the public domain. Now, this has proven to be challenging for businesses, and there's been a lot of pushback, backlash around what companies should do, perhaps instead of just reporting around what they're doing in these areas, what they should do in terms of how they can be more focused and how they can really drive change in areas most material to their business. We'll certainly get on to some of those as we move through this conversation together. But perhaps let's talk firstly a little bit about why we might be seeing some of this growing gap between ambition and preparedness. And there are many reasons, right? There are many reasons that have been published and shared. Some suggest it could be because some companies are still not necessarily feeling the pressure from consumers or maybe even from investors. Some may be feeling the need to shift or change their priorities because they are now facing competing pressures, sometimes between business objectives and sustainability objectives. Others have suggested that the task may just be too big, and actually the kind of change that is needed to really do things like deep traceability or to really manifest the kinds of impacts in the supply chain that one might expect, maybe the kinds of changes needed are just too big and require such a significant business transformation that it's more than they can bite off on their own. Now, here we've outlined a few potential sort of connected and slightly different reasons, one of which is also the complex regulatory regimes, and we'll talk more about the regulatory environment as we go through the rest of the session together, but also some challenges around the lack of standardization. Another relates to the lack of data and data preparedness, and again, we'll touch on this further as we navigate this call together. But certainly here, we have seen in the data space a huge amount of data, concerns and questions around data quality, concerns and questions around estimation of things like impact in spaces like Scope 3 and climate-related activities, but also in supply chain, ESG, and human rights. And we've also seen concerns and questions around just the general conflict between profitability and sustainability. Ultimately, what I think we're experiencing when we look at this challenge, the challenge of the growing gap between ambition and preparedness, is really a questioning of business and of business models. My feeling and sense here is that if we go back to the earlier days in sustainability, when there were so many metrics and so many different sets of expectations, whether it was GRI or whether it was the various different benchmarks or whether it was CSRD or Triple D, how they've evolved over time, is that this has become overwhelming for business. And it is also not the primary objective of business in many instances. However, there are many sustainability metrics within that remit, within that scope, that are highly material to companies and how they operate on a day-to-day basis. So when we ask the question of what companies should do instead, if they are scaling back, what they should do instead, I think it's really clear. It's really clear that double materiality assessments, the process of identifying the few really highly material sustainability issues that impact your business and not just vice versa, are the spaces to be operating. So that means if you're a business with a supply chain focus, then you need to go deep in supply chains. If you're a business that consumes lots of water, you need to go deep on water. If you're a business that is impacted or affected by climate change, which will be most, then these are spaces where one should be operating. But the list of thousands of KPIs are certainly overwhelming, and a double materiality assessment is a process that can get us really focused and really clear. I mean that when we do go deep to addressing this gap between ambition and preparedness, we can do it in such a way that by addressing the sustainability gap, we are addressing the business model directly. We're making businesses more resilient. We're supporting with their transformation objectives and ambition. And certainly that's going to be increasingly important as we really navigate the space we're at today of geopolitical, technological, economic, and other changes. We will definitely unpack these topics further as we navigate the following slides together. And let's use this as really the bridge to talking a bit more about the complex regulatory agenda, because it was certainly one of those items that really impacted our ability to best manage our ambitions and prepare well in ways that facilitate the right kinds of conversations with the board and at the investor level. So the regulatory agenda. This agenda has changed and is more complex than ever before, just like many of the other items we discussed earlier. For some regions, we're seeing a potential deregulation. We'll talk about that separately. But in other regions, we may be experiencing more of either a proliferation of regulation or potentially a regulatory soup where it is becoming overwhelming and difficult to distinguish and or manage all of these different regulatory agendas at once or in parallel. Certainly over the last few years, with the advent of EUDR, the European Deforestation Regulation, CSRD, CSR or CSDDD, etc., we have seen coming into the space of sustainability requirements around deforestation per se, but also looking at specific commodities within that EUDR space, increased expectations around biodiversity. We now have not just the Task Force for Climate-related Financial Disclosures, but also a whole nature agenda, which has emerged and is now front and center for many corporates. Likewise, we've seen linked to deforestation and the nature space a lot more very tangible and pointed discussions around land rights, which link to human rights, and a deeper focus actually on child labor and forced labor maybe than ever before. This sits all alongside of the emerging space and the additional expectations that have already been set relating to disclosure, reporting, and of course things like understanding physical climate risk and its impact on business models. Now, this agenda has become very significant in its own right, but companies, building on our previous topic, are not yet ready to cover and report on all of these topics. In fact, again, looking at the World Benchmarking Alliance, there are very few companies that have done really anything in the nature space. So when we look at TNFD, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, and all of the requirements and expectations there, it's still very much a new topic, which means that navigating the space, balancing expectations amongst investors, your internal corporate stakeholders, risk teams, compliance teams, supply chain teams, as well as your customers, consumers, is increasingly challenging. Let's talk about some of these in a little bit more detail. Now, I mentioned in introducing the regulatory agenda how there are so many regulations in particular in Europe and how that can potentially be overwhelming, and we spoke about a number of them, EUDR, CSRD, CSDDD, etc. But in parallel, we are seeing expectations around a rapid deregulatory agenda in the United States in particular, which I'm sure will spill over to other countries. And this has certainly been a centerpiece of Donald Trump's campaigns. Elon Musk in particular is leaning in heavily to support with the efficiencies that will come as a result of this sort of new agenda. And as a result, businesses are braced for deregulation at scale. The deregulation agenda will create a lot of ambiguity, though, for businesses, particularly those that have footprints both in the US and in Europe, as well as in other geographies such as Australia, New Zealand, etc., where there are different forces of regulation at play, all of which have different sets of expectations. So how will businesses deal with and manage all of these different regulatory requirements? Certainly, there's going to be a large expectation here for compliance teams, which now will become increasingly involved in the day-to-day running and management of the sustainability programs. So it's no longer just sustainability specialists, but we'll need those teams to work closely with compliance, and in many cases, both. We will start to see many people in the sustainability space with legal backgrounds or legal professionals. That's not just on the human rights side, but also probably going into just the general disclosure reporting and potentially even onto the climate side, especially where businesses have things like sustainability linked loans and bonds, and they're really looking at linking internal sustainability practices with what are legal requirements, with what are financial incentives, all of which become very tightly connected in a kind of complex web and interplay, sometimes in scenarios where they may potentially actually work against each other, and certainly may work against the business imperatives, business models, and the need for businesses to continue to be profitable and make money, as well as handling and managing and reporting on all of their regulatory requirements and expectations. So certainly this is going to be more and more of a challenge for business. Long story short, it's no longer just a case of more regulation, which is what we were seeing up until halfway through last year. It's now a case of more and less, and very different expectations in different geographies, creating a real challenge, complex challenge for businesses to navigate, requiring as a result deeper engagements with legal teams, deep engagements with risk teams, much more interconnectedness inside the corporate setting, and much more trade-off related discussions as businesses shape, trade-off, and evaluate what and how they're going to report or how they will manage all of these against the day-to-day business imperatives of their organization as it's shifting in a rapidly changing economic environment. Let's transition on to trend number 3, namely around geopolitics specifically. We've hinted at this many times now already in the previous 2 trends, but the geopolitical agenda, more than ever before, is going to be impacting the sustainability, ESG, and supply chain space more on a daily basis than ever before. And this will have both very clear agenda interests, and there will be interests relating to tariffs, clearly, but also where tariffs and associated flows of product may be linked to human rights and/or related activities, as we saw in China linked to Xinjiang over the last few years, and trade between China and the US. And obviously those challenges and those concerns are still being managed by CBP on a day-to-day basis, but linking that with tariffs is a kind of clear trend that we expect to see unfold throughout the rest of this year. But in addition to the kind of very clear and tangible trends, such as the ones we've just discussed, there will also be byproducts that come from geopolitics and from what could be potential production shifts. One very clear example that we're seeing on the bottom left of this slide is the fact that over the last few years, there's been a very tangible move to a lot more nearshoring or homeshoring. So long story short, production that may previously have happened in a country like China may have shifted either to Vietnam, which is more of an ally potentially, or other countries that are seen as allies, or back into Europe or into the US, depending on the client company in question. So we've certainly seen a lot more nearshoring or homeshoring activity, and a lot of kind of decoupling from the traditional supply chain and supply base. This comes with concerns or issues that are therefore unexpected and indirect. A very good example is transparency. Many of you in the supply chain space will know that transparency, particularly for us, is really all about understanding whether what one sees during an audit or when you're on site managing supply chain and ESG issues are real and accurate data. So our wages, working hours, and other records, an accurate reflection of what's happening in that particular factory. And certainly in countries like China, to some degree India, there have been long-term known risks in the space where often there are only a small percentage of suppliers, maybe 50%, that are actually truly transparent. And that percentage goes down depending on whether you're using your own audit protocol or whether you're using industry scheme audits. where there's a lot more at stake for a supplier. So transparency rates, which have previously been associated with countries like China as a risk, and have previously been seen as actually quite low risk issue in a country like Vietnam, are changing. We're certainly seeing for countries like Vietnam a decrease in transparency, and some of that is because many of those factories are owned by Chinese manufacturers. Likewise, we would also expect to see potentially decreases in transparency rates, maybe into some near adjacent Asian geographies, and possibly even in locations like the US or maybe into parts of Europe, or certainly into some of the near adjacent countries like Mexico, for instance, where we're seeing again large amounts of production being done in Mexico by Chinese companies in order to reduce the tariff exposure that they would have if they shipped directly from China to the US. So it's not just transparency, though, that is a risk as a result of changes in sourcing patterns and nearshoring. So are human rights issues and management systems issues. Human rights, for example, is definitely one we've seen become very clear in the media over the last 2 years in particular, where we've seen a large increase in the number of child and forced labor related media exposés in the US, as well as in parts of Europe. And a lot of this is down to really the intent by manufacturers, producers, to be able to produce at a lower price, which is the expectation of the end customer, but in actually what is quite a high cost country like the United States. And one of the few ways to continue producing at a low price is to use migrant workers to work a third shift, or potentially to use maybe prison labor or child labor. Of course, this is not endorsed or accepted really by any organizations or companies, but it is a risk nonetheless. Likewise, linked to that, there are management systems related risks that come with that, like less documentation of workers, also less documentation of shift work patterns, times that workers log in and out, some of which there may be a blind eye being turned to in order to really enable maybe undocumented workers or workers that shouldn't necessarily be operating in that country to work in a way that would support lower cost production. So these, what were previously less risky geographies like Europe and the US, become geographies that we need to focus on more clearly as a result of some of the geopolitical changes and as a result of home shoring, but still the need to produce in a low cost manner for business. Likewise, there'll be flip side risks in Asia, some of which I mentioned earlier, such as transparency issues in Vietnam, etc. Navigating onto the fourth topic, given that we were just talking about transparency, which is a key aspect of data, and in that case, we were talking about things like wages and working hours. Businesses today have more data than ever before. And the key questions, therefore, start to become questions around what do you do with this data? How do you know the data that you have is good? And how do you drive greater insight from data, especially when you have internal teams that may not be data experts? So how can you use things like AI? And how can you really double down on data quality? And certainly high quality data is going to be critical. We're also starting to see some questions being posed by the European Union again around data quality, most notably the EU requirements around ESG ratings and the disclosure of methodologies linked to ESG ratings, which could potentially also link to supply chains. There's still some ambiguity around exactly how that will be enforced, but our expectation certainly is that we will be needing to disclose a lot more about the supply chain ESG ratings methodologies linked to things like standard supply chain social compliance audits. Whether you have a factory that's A, B, C, or D, that's a ratings methodology that may, moving forward, need to be disclosed in the public domain to support investors to make better decisions leveraging the data that they're using. But likewise, businesses themselves also need to be able to make better decisions using the data that they're collecting, and therefore need to know that they're working with good quality data that allows them to get an accurate view of risk. I gave a good example earlier of maybe an audit conducted in a proprietary manner for a company using its own audit protocol in a way where it's deployed by that company directly, and how that sort of audit, particularly if there's a strong relationship between the company and or the supplier and vendor, can really lead to a high level of transparency and a really high quality set of results versus an industry scheme assessment that might be used by multiple different businesses that is traditionally associated with a much lower transparency rate. So unfortunately with that, a lower level of quality and therefore probably better insight into risk and therefore better, or rather worse insight into risk and therefore worse abilities to kind of make decisions and or effectively to manage those risks accordingly. Let's talk a little bit about how you should think about defining your approach therefore to data and ultimately how you can layer things like AI into that data stack. The starting point is transparency, working with suppliers and building a relationship that's based on trust, a relationship where you have mutual confidence in each other's goals and objectives around the responsible sourcing program is the best way to drive highly transparent, high quality data sets from your supplier base. And this is absolutely top priority. Without good quality data, we really have nothing on which to build a program. Secondly, these data sets, as we will talk to shortly, also need to be increasingly holistic. We know that even good quality audit programs really are just often using a single lever, i.e. the audit itself, to get insight into the risk environment and to get insight into how those risks should be managed. But that is no longer enough. We know it's no longer enough because the world is changing much faster, and also because the audit methodology was designed many years ago and hasn't typically been changed that much. Certainly within LRQA, we have integrated worker surveys into the audit process. So it's no longer just about inspection, observation, and obviously the sort of inquiry processes, which are usually the basis of triangulation, but it's also about then collecting additional insights directly from workers through an anonymous survey, providing a fourth layer. That is definitely one way to improve the data, to improve and make it more holistic by getting additional insights and enhancing the quality of the audit itself. But there are many other data sets that are becoming very relevant, such as grievance mechanism data, e-learning deployment, corrective action plan data, and of course things like adverse media insights coming from tools like the Sentinel tool that we have within our EIQ platform. The role of AI starts to become very interesting here, because if you're a company and you have audit data, whether it's in physical PDF or Word audit reports, or in a platform like EIQ, worker surveys, worker sentiment, grievance mechanism, e-learning, corrective action plan data, data on adverse media, this can be overwhelming. And it's critical that you are able to connect the dots between all of these different data sets. You need to connect the dots because you need to know whether audits have been remediated, which I think is a bit more of a space where people in responsible sourcing have strong competence through the direct corrective action plan process that comes out of a regular audit. But you also need to be able to connect the dots to know if other items are being flagged through worker surveys or grievance mechanisms that may be coming through maybe more real time. Certainly a grievance can come in at any point in time and therefore operates in between and around maybe your once or potentially twice a year annual audit, or in some cases, maybe even an audit every couple of years. So you're certainly able to connect the dots within the audit, around the audit, and then with this additional information that comes in. But equally, you'll want to be connecting the dots with other public domain insights that you're collecting as a business. And you'll want to be connecting the dots with other business metrics in your organization. Metrics such as production quality, production timeline, timeliness, or other things that might be sitting on your balance scorecard. So as a business, it has become increasingly imperative to start linking supply chain ESG data and metrics, to start building and improving and enhancing the scope of those metrics, make them more holistic to your core day-to-day business practices in those rich scorecards, and also to be using this in order to form predictive insights about the nature of your supply chain, the risks that may be coming up in your supply chain, and how you might respond to them accordingly. And of course, this is where something like artificial intelligence is really critical. And we're actually plugging and layering whether it's Microsoft Copilot or other generative AI, on top of your existing data sets, such as what we might do in EIQ, or actually in your own internal systems, or using Power BI or equivalent data aggregation environments, is potentially a short form way to start to really build new insights, additional insights, and more tangibly connect data to your day-to-day business practices. There's a lot more that we could say here, but I'll park the remainder for now, and we can certainly cover those at a later point in time. Let's talk, however, about the next key topic, which we've also alluded to a lot during the conversation so far, namely one of suppliers, supplier relations, and how those might evolve in this new operating environment. Historically, when we've talked about suppliers and supplier relationship and management, we've seen this as maybe more of a compliance conversation, a conversation where the codes of conduct and expectations of corporates have been sent to suppliers, and there's been expectations to align and comply and to show continuous improvement within those respective spaces. As we look at the world today, that will absolutely continue, but we all, I think, recognize that suppliers receive lots of different sets of codes of conduct. The idea of actually streamlining this through things like industry standards or schemes that were supposed to really reduce the audit demand may have helped partly, but suppliers still have lots of different expectations coming towards them. There's also an excessive focus maybe on the issues themselves that sit in checklists rather than on the root causes, and maybe not really enough long-term thinking around how one can support suppliers from instead the space of compliance to one of partnership and driving meaningful change in the supply base as they themselves look to really navigate this changing operating environment. Also, as part of this, it is rarely the case that what suppliers are doing is really cascaded down into the day-to-day practices that one sees on the factory floor. So workers themselves are often not really meaningfully engaged in the kind of change that one's looking to drive in the supplier base. Of course, if you disagree with me, please do feel free to kind of share your thoughts in the chat or in any kind of follow-up questions afterwards. Very happy to discuss in more detail. But put that all aside, I think we all recognize there is a need for change. Change not just from the supplier perspective, but also from the buyer perspective. And not just is there a need for change, but there's an opportunity for change, because we sit today in a space where the kind of legacy way of working, the compliance-oriented approach, it's not really working well for suppliers. It's not really working that well for buyers either, as they often are in situations where they may not be having the kind of impact they really want. Actually can be high cost to drive these sorts of changes. There's a lot of ongoing audits that often do not really show the kinds of improvements one wants, certainly in some of the lagging issues around things like wages, working hours. And the whole narrative is arguably broken, right? The narrative of compliance rather than a narrative of incentive is arguably broken. That having been said, moving to an incentive narrative is certainly the space that we need to be looking at in parallel to the compliance narrative. The incentive narrative gets us to a space where we can start to talk to suppliers in a collaborative way, start to talk to suppliers about how to facilitate a shift to new ways of operating, to support investment in things like solar panels or other renewable energies that can support real long-term changes, not just in energy consumption and emissions specifically, but also in business models by making suppliers more resilient to energy prices, etc. And that kind of change is exactly what we're seeing the need to have a trend towards in 2025 and beyond. This will drive a massive shift in how one engages between supplier and customer or corporate customer. There are a lot of analyses on this, which we've seen over the last couple of years. Here on the left-hand side, you can see one from McKinsey, where we're certainly seeing that in situations where there have been deeper partnership-based approaches, that there are much greater returns both for suppliers and also for the companies involved. And there are many ways in which this can start, right? So it can start through digital training that aligns suppliers and supplier management with many of the issues that sit within an ESG/responsible sourcing program, that align them with some of the targets and goals and objectives of your business, that align them with the regulatory requirements. So within LRQA and EIQ specifically, we have an e-learning environment and platform that has been used very well to this effect, with well over 1 million factories now having completed our e-learning modules. But those can also be linked very tangibly to kind of core business goals and objectives, particularly if you're working with suppliers where you have long-term relationships and are looking at continuing those long-term relationships in ways where you want deeper levels of trust, higher synergies, higher collaboration, and deeper partnership. Equally, shared data channels to centralize reporting, to enhance performance monitoring and improvement activities. So what we mean here specifically is where there's data on suppliers that's coming out of audits and or benchmarking and trending around best practices that are seen in the supply chain sustainability space or social compliance space, why not share that with suppliers? Bring them into workshops, bring them into supplier conferences and events, share that aggregate data, share best practices. There's no reason not to do this, right? This will enable better learning. It will enable them to understand how it can be more tangibly linked to core business models and practices. And it will also build a stronger, more aligned way of working between your company and that supplier. Thirdly, stakeholder engagement is, of course, critical. Many of you will have very good long-term relationships with suppliers, and that is exactly the kind of approach that is going to be increasingly important moving forward. One-to-ones between kind of corporates and suppliers, but also in situations where corporates may be supporting the brokering of further conversations with financial service partners, or maybe even with insurance space, kind of bringing in, enriching the whole dialogue around supply chain, ESG, and sustainability, setting up both a carrot and stick approach in order to support the continuous improvement objectives that we're looking for. So we as a business recognize, and I'm sure you do, that collectively more is being asked of suppliers than ever before. In order to deliver more, you're going to need different ways of working that facilitate deeper, more trust-based engagement. And only by doing that, by building those longer-term relationships with your key material suppliers, you can't do this necessarily everywhere all the time, but with your key suppliers, are you likely to see outperformance? Are you likely to see greater synergies? Will you get the kind of innovation, outputs, and ESG performance that you're aiming for? Let's move on to trend number 6. I won't dwell too much on this one because we've certainly covered a lot of this ground already in previous parts of this call together. But trend number 6 is really around managing risks in what were previously low risk geographies, but that now might have shifted into the kind of higher risk space. What we can see here, we do have a separate webinar and a lot of separate analytics on this where we go deeply into all of these different metrics twice per year. But what we can certainly see here is that countries like Australia, South Africa, and the United States are countries that have shifted from a medium into a higher risk position over the course of the last 2 years. And some of that is down to some of the topics I mentioned before, such as the increased use and reliance on migrant workers, definitely for Australia as well as the United States. And some of it, of course, is down to higher levels of transparency, better engagement, and using audit tools that better surface the risks that are faced in supply chains. The key story here, though, is that we're seeing more and more supply chain ESG risks in geographies that were previously considered to be low-risk environments. You can see on the next slide a number of these that were actually covered last year, in particular in the forced labor and child labor spaces. And I'm sure we will see more of these being signposted during the course of 2025 and beyond, as many of those key geographies we just discussed, like the United States, Europe, etc., are likely to see high levels of migration, inflation, political differences locally and internationally, as well as a growing use of technology in both the supply chain spaces, but also in the spaces of journalism and also by investors, academics, and other actors that may be pulling together these sorts of exposés. Very briefly as well, to just summarize what we've seen in terms of a trend over the last few years, again in the ESG space, highlighting what we recently just covered. You can see now not just looking at the overall risk, but actually looking at it through the lens of labor, environment, business ethics, management systems, as well as health and safety, most of which show some form of downwards trend over the last few years. What this really means is that as we're coming into 2025, and we're now a few weeks into it, there are at least 45 to 50 countries that are already considered as high to extreme risk for child labor or forced labor, which is a number higher than in many of the previous years, and also a risk that as businesses will be needing to navigate in a much more nuanced and careful way than ever before. Let's move on to trend number 7 before we go into the final few minutes and Q&A. Trend number 7 is really around the synergies between food safety, product integrity, and sustainability. We referenced earlier the advent of EUDR, the European Deforestation Regulation, and through that regulation, the identification of a number of key commodities that are now in scope and where there is an expectation for businesses to be evidencing risk management and or to be diversifying their supply chains in order to move away from what are recognized and known high risk markets for each of those different commodities. Not only are there really clear and more relevant and day-to-day signposting around some of those commodities through the EUDR, but we're also seeing the similar sorts of trends occurring on the consumer side, where consumers are now asking questions, more and more questions around whether commodities, products are being ethically sourced with limited or reduced environmental impacts. Likewise, we're seeing climate change playing an increasingly critical role in each of those commodity areas and in the safe and secure medium-term supply of food. Climate change is also leading to questions around new sourcing locations for food supply. In fact, we're starting to see a lot of food production that may have previously happened in certain geographies now happening in new environments that are amenable to it because of the changing climate in each of those respective regions. This also means changing relationships with labor, leads to migrant worker risks, and so on. Now, as we start to navigate the convergence of food safety, product integrity, and sustainability, we will definitely see the role of technology increasing, not just in terms of things like supply chain traceability, but also technology being used more and more on the ground to provide real-time insight into water management, water risks, technology being used in things like regenerative farming, also in packaging and packaging innovation. And this will occur alongside the need for businesses to really meet those evolving legislative requirements. 2025 is going to be a year where all of this comes together. It's going to be a year where we see the ethical sourcing of commodities, food safety questions, the role of technology, legislation, all coming together as really a new pivotal trend that brings food safety right front and center into the responsible sourcing arena. Lastly, let's talk about investors and the investor influence. It's certainly been the case that the finance community has embraced ESG most over the last kind of 5 to 10 years in particular. This includes in all areas of finance like stock ratings, portfolios, deals and related due diligence, private equity, all areas of finance. And without wanting to be too controversial, we could also say that this deep engagement of the finance community into the ESG space has got pulled and connected closely to political agendas and weaponized by both sides, whether it's kind of blue or red, Democrat or conservative. As a result of this, we've seen a lack of trust and a lot of questions around many of the tools that were used by the finance community to support ESG ratings and metrics. Good examples of these are things like some of the early estimation tools around Scope 3 emissions, around supply chain ESG, around nature, around product risks. And we will certainly have to navigate this very carefully as we get access to more and more data, and as we, through that data, are starting to see a close in the data gap. What I mean by that is, where previously we used to use estimation methodologies to produce Scope 3 data insights, now that we're starting to collect that directly from suppliers, we may see differences in what was disclosed in the past versus what was disclosed today and in the present. This links to my previous comments about the EU ESG ratings methodologies. It also means that there are going to be questions around the role of investors in shaping the ESG agenda and on the impact of investors as they do that, as they shape the agenda. Because their methodologies, their tools will be changing. They'll be changing not just because they have better data, not just because they have better access, or because they have more technology, but also because the investor agenda is likely to be partially influenced as well by the political agendas that we're increasingly aware of. Even though ESG is likely to stay in the investor space and therefore will strongly impact corporates, it's more likely that we will start to see a lot more discussions around some of the sub-themes like climate change or supply chains than around ESG as a kind of general trend. Now, perhaps let's just move on to the final takeaway slide before we break for questions. Right, we've certainly covered a lot of ground during this call. A few key takeaways as you look to optimize your approach to managing risks in 2025 in order to navigate from risk through resilience and into opportunity. It's certainly clear that an approach to supply chain, ESG, or sustainability 100% needs to be data-driven, more today than ever before. The good news is we have a lot more data already. There's more data in the public domain, and there are better solutions and tools out there to support that data-driven approach to risk management. But quality and data quality will be a massive differentiator, not using self-assessment questionnaires, not using data that's coming from a low level of transparency base, using real-world audit-driven data and data that is coming from robust tools that facilitate high levels of transparency from suppliers. Secondly, being agile and efficient. This means finding ways to bring that data together, use AI, use the wider digital momentum, use ways also that not only reflect audit insights, but that combine that with real-world intelligence coming from things like adverse media scans and so on and so forth, to give you not just much more of a real-time program overview, but one that is data-based, data-led, and data-driven. Also, using more innovative tools, so expanding beyond just the audit to a world where one is adding additional layers into the audit, but also where one is using things like grievance mechanisms, worker surveys, e-learning, etc. And designing a program that combines multiple different tools into a form that is future fit, one that is proactively flagging risks and allowing you to get in front of that and engage deeply with your suppliers in ways that facilitate long-term, deep, trust-based relationships. Of course, this means holistic programs, connecting the dots, not just from the different sources I've mentioned externally and from your program design, but also inside your own business. So you're connecting the dots between responsible sourcing programs, core business goals and metrics to actively facilitate the transition of your business model. And that will be really very clear in the supply chain space, but also in the spaces of water, carbon, and climate, which are often going to be highly material issues for those of you on the call. And then really leveraging and leaning into the kind of human intelligence space, building deep trust-based relationships, being solutions-oriented, working closely with your internal teams and with your suppliers as you navigate this change from risk to opportunity. So thank you all very much. I can see there's a few questions that have come in. And I think we may have a couple of minutes to just go back to Andy to see what those questions are.
Yep, thank you very much, Kevin, and thank you for sharing all of those fantastic insights. And just a reminder, you can still submit your questions through the questions pane in the control panel, and any that we don't get to today, we will pick up afterwards as well. First question for you, Kevin. What will be the impact of climate-related risks for supply chains in the upcoming year? And what should businesses prioritize in regard to managing climate data effectively?
Thanks, Andy. That's a very big question. And of course, not knowing exactly where climate events are going to manifest during the course of 2025, I would say that actually 2 points. Point one, transitioning to look at physical climate risk directly is going to be very important. Just a little over a year ago, in one of our leadership series events with customers, I asked the audience of over 100 corporates which ones had actually done physical climate risk analysis of their supply chain. And out of around 100 people, only 1 or 2 actually put up their hand. So the first part to answering your question is 100% you need to do physical climate risk analysis of a supply chain. This is a requirement under TCFD. And actually, it's one of the things that drove a lot of the TCFD and climate agenda initially. Companies in the past have been very focused on emissions and reducing emissions without necessarily looking deeply enough at whether their supply chain will be impacted by climate events. And that needs to change in 2025. Secondly, looking at emissions and emissions themselves, 100% as well, this is going to be important, but here things really need to shift to actually supporting key suppliers in their journey to improvement programs. So it's no longer enough to just capture emissions at the supplier level, or actually even move to capturing emissions at supplier level, because that may still be a gap for many companies on the phone. But one needs to dig in deeper, support those businesses to set up improvement projects and programs. Often this involves deeper engineering capability, programs of work that could take 6, 12, 18 months to unfold. And of course, it links into things like solar panel installation or using other forms of renewable energy, some really easy, low-touch approaches like being more efficient with your use of energy as it is, turning off lights and making sure that you don't use heating when you don't need it, and so on and so forth. But then there will also be potentially some process re-engineering changes that might be needed in facilities. So key points here, I think, really are do a physical climate risk analysis, understand where those physical climate risks manifest, and really engage deeply with suppliers to help them prepare and respond and to be more resilient. And then secondly, go beyond just collecting climate or carbon data to deeper programs that you embed with suppliers to facilitate long-term improvement and to facilitate that transition to a greener and cleaner supply base. With that, you might also want to lean into working with some of the financial services providers who increasingly do have incentives in the form of sustainability-linked loans, bonds, or preferential rates that can be extended to suppliers to help facilitate the kind of investment needed to make that change.
Okay, thank you very much, Kevin. And we'll just squeeze one more question in on the call today. So for businesses that are struggling to manage and centralize their data, what can they do first to begin improving supply chain due diligence?
That's a great question, Andy. Clearly, there's a lot of data out there. Look, I think the first thing always is to ask yourself a question around the quality of the data that you have today. So, have a look at your program. Is it one that is your own, that you designed and are rolling out? Is it a standard like maybe the elevated responsible sourcing assessment that we have within LRQA that you can use, or is it an industry scheme? Understand whether the tools you're using now are generating good, high quality data. Is that data transparent? Look at that by country. Work with suppliers to actually support the improvement on transparency rates by giving them the confidence that by being open to you and or any others that might be using the audit report, that there won't be any recrimination that negatively impacts the sourcing relationship they have with your business. So point one, really look at transparency, look at your program design, make sure that it supports and is leaning into facilitating high levels of transparency and that you've got the right tools. And then I think we actually get to a place where we can start to aggregate the data across the different audits, across the corrective actions, where you can start to think about using additional tools like worker surveys to improve and enhance that, and where you can start to, of course, look at things like grievance mechanisms and so on. Of course, there are tools like EIQ that do bring all of this together in a single environment where you can ask the kinds of questions you need, get real-time insights into your program, but you can also use tools like Power BI to kind of connect that data within your own business if it might be coming from different environments. Certainly, this is a space we can help you in a lot more detail, so please do feel free to connect with myself, Andy, or others in the team offline.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Kevin. And thanks everyone for participating. That's all we can squeeze in today. But again, if you have not had your question answered on the call, we will be sending you a separate follow-up. So thank you all very much for attending. You will receive a short survey after this. We would appreciate if you could complete that to provide your feedback to help us inform future sessions. And we will also send you a follow-up in the next few days on the recording of this session. Our full report on this topic will also be published very soon. Please follow us on LinkedIn to stay in touch on that and everything else. And on behalf of LRQA and all of us in the ERQ team, thanks a lot for joining us and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.